In our last lesson, we built several objects that will allow us to integrate a custom authentication object into the Spring Security Framework. In this lesson, we're going to continue that work by modifying our authentication provider and our security context.xml file. So if we look at our authentication filter, you'll notice that we invoke the authenticate method on the authentication manager. And this is going to wind up invoking the authenticate method on our authentication provider. But first, we need to make sure that our authentication provider supports our new custom authentication token. So we're going to change up the type from a username password authentication token to a custom authentication token so that our authentication provider supports it. Now that we know we will be receiving a custom authentication token as an argument to our authentication method, we can then switch up our casting. So I'm going to cast to a custom authentication token, and that's going to require me to switch this type. And then I can also return a new custom authentication token as our authentication object to verify that authentication was successful. We're going to use that second custom authentication token constructor that we created, and that constructor accepts the make as a parameter in the constructor. So we're going to use the accessor on the make field, and we're going to pass that into that second custom authentication token constructor. Now that we have switched over the types, we're going to incorporate the additional logic that will take into consideration that make parameter. We are going to throw an exception if our user is null. And then we're going to add an OR operator in there, and we're going to begin to build out our authentication logic. Our authentication logic is pretty simple. If the passwords do not match or the make of the user's car is not Subaru, we're not going to accept this user's authentication. We're only going to allow Subarus to be worked on within our auto service center. What I'll do is I will check the token and I will get the make, and then I'll just use equals ignore case, and I'm going to check for Subaru, and then I'm just going to negate that whole statement. So at this point, our authentication provider has been modified to support our custom authentication token. Now it's just a matter of configuring our custom authentication filter within our security context.xml file. So now let's navigate to our security context.xml file. The first thing that you'll notice within this file is that I have included some of the configuration for the authentication filter ahead of time. The configuration is quite large, and this is not something you would typically remember. Instead of typing this out, I'm just going to speak through the different pieces of configuring this filter. So you'll notice that we created a bean, and the bean points to our custom authentication filter type. Now remember, that type extends the username and password authentication filter, and in turn, that extends the abstract authentication processing filter, which is further up the type hierarchy. What we're setting actually is a lot of the properties on that abstract authentication processing filter. So it asks for a filter processes URL, and this is simply the URL that will handle the login post. So when we post our login form, it's where we're going to direct that request to. We've configured that within our form login up above. You'll see a lot of these being copied from the form login. They're very similar within our custom form login bean, and that's because the namespace is doing a lot of this translation for you. You'll also notice that we need to provide a reference to the authentication manager. So we're going to go ahead and give our authentication manager an alias of authentication manager. You'll also notice we specify the username parameter for our form, the password parameter for our form, as well as a success handler. And this success handler says where we should navigate after we have authenticated the user. And here we're just saying go to the root context. We also have an authentication failure handler, which is very similar, except it says where do we go when authentication fails. Now, one of the new items we've added here is a login URL authentication entry point. And you see this bean, we're providing a value of /login. This is simply a bean that says, where do we go when we need to authenticate a user? So a user attempts to access a protected resource, we need to direct them to that authentication process, and we start by sending them to /login, which will show our login form. We actually need to register that bean within our HTTP tag. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the ID of that bean, and we'll navigate up to the HTTP tag, and there's an attribute on this tag which is the entry point reference, and we're just going to point to that bean. Now while we're here, we're also going to remove the auto config attribute because we're no longer auto configuring our authentication. Instead, we're going to be spelling it out within our filter. The final thing we'll need to do within our configuration is remove our form login tag because we are going to rely upon our new authentication filter to perform our login. We need to remove that tag, and then we're going to add a custom filter tag. And this custom filter tag needs to point to our new custom filter bean. So we're simply going to take the ID of that bean and place it in the ref attribute so that we point to this new custom filter and add it into our filter proxy chain. Now, when we specify a custom filter, we also need to provide a position for that filter. The position we're going to specify is the form_login filter. And this designates that we're going to be using this filter on form login. So at this point, we're going to restart our server, navigate to the browser. So let's first attempt to authenticate using our JRDO user, and I'll supply the password of password, and we're going to say that their automobile make is a Chevy. You'll notice that our custom authentication provider restricts the authentication for the user because of the make of the car they provided, which was contained on that custom authentication object. Now let's try the same credentials with a Subaru as the make. And there we see we can log into the application. So we were able to create a custom authentication object and register that object via a custom filter and some modifications to our authentication provider. This lesson should provide you with the groundwork if you need to modify the authentication processes of Spring Security. I can't predict every authentication need you will have, but you should be able to use this lesson as a template if those needs arise.